Now, joining us live via Skype is Deputy Labor Leader Richard Marles. Richard Marles, thank you for your time. Now, we have seen some pretty strong responses from New South Wales Police in particular in dealing with people out flouting these rules, sunbaking when they should be staying home. Do you agree with the severity of those measures?
I think people need to be doing the right thing. That's the point to be taken here. This is changing our lives in a radical way. All of us are doing things differently, and I think fundamentally the Australian people have responded magnificently to this. But life is changing, and where people think that they can continue life in a normal way and that those normal social activities are going to continue, well, that's just not how it is. And we need to be making sure that we're putting that in, we're enforcing the rules that are there, and that people do play their part in putting in place appropriate social distancing.
Victoria's taken a harder line than it seems we've seen from other states, saying that partners who don't live together can't see each other unless it's some kind of caregiving. The definition of that seems to be pretty vague. Do you think that's fair to ask partners to not see each other?
Well, again, I think that the rules are in place and they're based on households maintaining social isolation and people being within the households that they're in. This is an unprecedented moment, and it is really important that we have appropriate social distancing in place. That's how we're actually going to get past this. And you only need to look at what we've seen from overseas to understand how significant this is.
But if you live alone and your partner lives alone, is it not just as risky for you to see each other as two partners who live together? Even still less so, really.
Well, again, I just think we need to be abiding by what are the guidelines that have been put in place, and those, they're not guidelines actually, they're enforceable proclamations from government, and it's really important that households are maintaining social isolation. So I think this is a difficult period of time, but we've got to abide by those rules if we're going to get through this and avoid the kinds of things that we've witnessed in places like Milan and New York.
If I could ask you about the wage subsidy program, this has been one of the biggest injections of money in the Australian economy by a government basically in history. Do you think that this has been the right move, or are we going to be paying this off for decades to come without seeing the benefit that really that amount of investment should bring us?
It is important that we are taking the economic action needed to get Australia through this moment. Now, we've been calling for a wage subsidy for a number of weeks now, and to give credit where it's due, what the government has announced in the last couple of days puts that into effect, and I think it's going to be a matter of enormous relief for the tens of thousands of working people around Australia who have been stood down in the last couple of weeks. So the government deserves credit for that, and we support it, and we do think that this is a very important measure, and we've made it clear that as soon as the government gets the legislation drafted, we stand ready to attend Parliament to make sure that this goes through the Parliament.
What do you make of this story from The Australian today that the Treasurer contacted 4 retail leaders in making this decision on the wage subsidies, including Solomon Lew, who very early pulled out of paying any rents, which was a seismic thing to do at a time like this? Others who've been accused of underpaying staff on a systemic basis. Was that the right call?
Well, I mean, the government is going to engage in the consultation that it does to understand what it needs to do to take the next step forward. I think basically what we witnessed last week with the enormous queues outside of Centrelink stood as made it completely obvious to everyone that there needed to be a wage subsidy, or else what we were going to see was literally millions of people shifted from work to welfare, and that cannot be a good outcome. It's really important through this that the relationship, the employee-employer relationship, is maintained. That's the importance of the wage subsidy, because it allows that to occur, and that's why we were calling for it a couple of weeks ago. But I think those cues made it very plain to the government what they needed to do. It would have been better if we hadn't seen them and that the government had been there a bit earlier, but they have got to the plate here, and they deserve credit for that, and we support the steps that they've taken.
What do you make of the government sticking to its guns on tax cuts, income tax cuts, and the submarine spending program? Are those two things that we should be cutting back on at a time like this?
Well, firstly, they're two different questions. In relation to the proposed tax cuts, we've been saying for a long time that it's very hard to judge what the economy is going to be come 2024-25. Certainly that was hard to judge back in 2019. I think what has played out in the last few months makes it clear that it's hard for any of us to exactly see what the future holds in relation to this. So as to the future of those tax cuts, we've always felt that that's a decision much better made closer to the date when we've got a proper sense of where the budget's at, and that continues to be our view. And to be honest, I think that looks like a pretty good call now that we made last year, given what has played out. In relation to the spend on the submarines, it is a very important asset in terms of shaping our strategic circumstances, which were as complicated as they'd ever been since the Second World War prior to the coronavirus, but are made even more complicated by this. And I think this is one of the emerging stories in relation to coronavirus, perhaps not so much now, but as we come to the back end of this, it stands with the very real prospect of rewriting the strategic landscape that Australia finds itself in. In that context, we need to have an ability to shape the world as best we can, given who we are, and submarines are completely central to that. So I don't think our strategic circumstances are going to get any easier going forward as a result of the coronavirus, and it is the difficulty of our strategic circumstances which fundamentally shapes how we should be spending in relation to defence.
And just finally, the medical authorities have been keeping a very strong eye on the coronavirus cases curve. They've said that it does seem like there is progress being made, that they have landed a punch, but it's certainly not over yet. Do you think we're doing everything we need to do to keep this curve going the way it needs to?
I think we've taken enormous steps in the last couple of weeks in relation to social distancing. I think the country has come on a very long journey. Australians get it now about what needs to happen if we're going to avoid the scenes that we have witnessed overseas. And the sacrifice that's being made by people has been magnificent, and Australians deserve an enormous amount of credit. I think the restrictions that we've put in place on our border are also really important, and we've obviously got to make sure that we continue with significant amounts of testing of the coronavirus. I hope that if we are able to do all these things, that we will see the curve go in the right direction. But it's very important that we remain vigilant. It's very important that we're not proclaiming a premature victory here. There's a lot of water to go under the bridge, and a few days of pleasing results in terms of a reduction in the number of new cases is obviously a good thing, but that doesn't mean that this crisis is over. There is still a long way to go, and we've got to remain vigilant.